The low, insistent growl of my stomach was the soundtrack to that Friday night. It was a familiar melody, the anthem of a college student surviving on a diet of ramen, cafeteria pizza, and optimistic denial. My apartment, a cramped one-bedroom that I affectionately called the cave, was in its typical state of organized chaos. Textbooks formed precarious towers on the coffee table, a constellation of dirty mugs decorated every available surface, and my laptop glowed, its screen filled with the daunting, blinking cursor of a half-written essay on postmodernist literature. My roommate, Chloe, was out on a date, and the silence in the apartment was a heavy, tangible thing, broken only by the distant hum of city traffic 10 stories below and my own grumbling belly. My name is Jake. At 21, I was navigating the thrilling and terrifying limbo between adolescence and adulthood, where the freedom to eat ice cream for dinner was constantly at war with the dread of impending student loan payments. That night, adulthood was winning, primarily in the form of that cursed essay. I'd been staring at the same paragraph for 45 minutes, the words swimming before my eyes. I needed a break. I needed sustenance. I pushed back from my desk, the chair groaning in protest, and padded into the small, galley-style kitchen. The fluorescent light flickered to life, illuminating a landscape of stark reality. The fridge, when I opened it, offered a depressing tableau, a half-empty bottle of ketchup, a wilting head of lettuce, and a container of yogurt that had definitely seen better days. The pantry was no better. It was a true low point. I sighed, resigning myself to another bowl of generic cereal for dinner. As I reached for the box, a memory, sharp and clear, cut through my hunger-induced haze. My mom. Her last visit, a whirlwind of maternal energy and concern for my domestic survival skills. She'd pressed a heavy, stoneware casserole dish into my hands. For emergencies, she'd said, her voice laced with that particular mix of love and worry that only mothers can master. It's your favorite, just heat and eat. But Jake, she'd added, her tone turning serious, be careful. The dish is ancient. It was your great-grandmother's. Always use the potholders, the thick ones. It holds heat like nobody's business. I'd thanked her, given her a hug, and promptly forgotten about it, stashing the dish in the back of the bottom kitchen cabinet, behind a bag of potatoes that had since begun to sprout alien-looking tentacles. An emergency. Well, if this wasn't an emergency, I didn't know what was. My stomach gave another theatrical rumble, as if in agreement. Getting the dish out was an archaeological dig. I had to move the bag of sprouting potatoes, a rogue onion that had rolled into the far corner, and a forgotten jar of pickles. Finally, my fingers brushed against the cold, rough stoneware. I hauled it out, setting it on the counter with a solid thunk. It was a beast of a thing, cream-colored with a simple blue pattern around the rim, heavy and substantial, a relic from a time when things were built to last. I peeled back the aluminum foil. Inside was a frozen solid block of my childhood, her famous lasagna. Layers of pasta, rich meat sauce, and a generous blanket of cheese, now encased in a frosty tomb. Salvation, but it was going to take a while. I preheated the oven, slid the frozen monument inside, and set the timer for an hour. The wait was agonizing. The first tantalizing whiffs of garlic and tomato began to seep into the apartment after about 20 minutes, a form of culinary torture. To distract myself, I decided to be productive. I dragged my vacuum cleaner out of the closet, the roar of its motor a welcome replacement for the silence. I vacuumed the living room rug, wiped down the counters, and even attacked the dreaded tower of dirty mugs, loading them into the dishwasher. I was a man transformed, a domestic god awaiting his divine reward. Finally, the timer chimed its glorious bell. Using the thick, quilted potholders as my mom had instructed, I carefully pulled the bubbling, magnificent lasagna from the oven. It was a beautiful sight. The cheese was golden and blistered in spots, the sauce bubbling lazily around the edges. The aroma was intoxicating, a symphony of herbs, cheese, and slow-cooked meat that filled the entire apartment. I set the steaming dish on the stovetop to cool for a few minutes, my mouth watering in anticipation. I grabbed a plate and a serving spatula, ready to commit what felt like a sacred act of consumption. That's when it happened. The sound was so alien, so completely out of place in the context of my quiet, solitary evening, that my brain took a full second to process it. It wasn't the key in the lock jangle I was used to. It was the distinct, metallic shunk clunk of the deadbolt turning, followed by the rasp of the doorknob twisting. The front door, the one directly across from the kitchen entrance, swung open. It didn't burst open. It wasn't violent. It just opened, smoothly, as if the person on the other side had every right to be there. And standing in the doorway was a man. He wasn't tall or particularly intimidating. He was of average height, wearing a dark hoodie pulled up over his head, despite the mild spring evening, and jeans. He had a gaunt, tired face, with stubble dotting his chin. But his eyes were what froze the blood in my veins. They were wide, darting around the apartment with a frantic, skittish energy, like a trapped animal. They were glassy and unfocused. In one hand, he held a set of keys. My first, absurd thought was, is that the pizza guy? But I hadn't ordered pizza. My second thought, a cold spike of pure adrenaline, was, this is not Chloe. We stood there, frozen in a bizarre tableau. Me, in my kitchen, holding a spatula poised over a lasagna, a quilted potholder on my other hand. Him, in my doorway, breathing heavily, his body tensed as if ready to spring. Time seemed to warp, stretching and compressing. It couldn't have been more than 2 or 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. 1,000 scenarios flashed through my mind, all ending badly. My heart was a jackhammer against my ribs, so loud I was sure he could hear it. My fight-or-flight response was screaming, a primal siren in my head, but my body was locked in place, a statue of shock and fear. His wild eyes scanned the room, from me, to the steaming lasagna, to the vacuum cleaner I'd left in the middle of the living room floor. His gaze lingered on the food. I saw his nostrils flare. And then, his eyes met mine. He took a half step forward. I live here, he slurred. His voice was rough, thick with something, alcohol, or maybe something else. That broke the spell. The sheer, illogical wrongness of his statement unlocked my vocal cords. No, you don't, I said, my own voice sounding thin and reedy, a stranger's. This is my apartment. You need to leave. I tightened my grip on the spatula. It was a pathetic weapon, a flimsy piece of metal and plastic, but it was all I had. He shook his head, a slow, ponderous motion. No, man, this is 10B, my place. He took another step, his movements unsteady. He was now fully inside my apartment, and the door was still open behind him, a yawning rectangle leading to the safety of the well-lit hallway. The smell of the lasagna was even stronger now, mixing with a faint, sour odor coming from him. My mind was racing. 10B. He had the key. He thought he lived here. Was he confused? Drunk? Did he have the wrong floor? We were on the 10th floor. Apartment B. He was right about that. But this was my home. You have the wrong apartment, I said, trying to inject authority into my voice that I did not feel. You need to go. Now. I took a step forward myself, brandishing the spatula like a sword. It must have been a ridiculous sight, but I was desperate. His eyes, which had been fixed on me, drifted back to the lasagna. He stared at it with an intensity that was unnerving. He licked his lips. That smells really good, he mumbled. And in that bizarre, surreal moment, a new thought cut through the panic. This wasn't a movie. This wasn't a home invasion by a calculating criminal. This was a lost, intoxicated, and very disoriented man. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was now mingled with a confusing, reluctant pang of pity. Are you hungry? The words were out of my mouth before I could stop them. I didn't know where they came from. It was an insane thing to ask an intruder. My survival instincts were probably screaming in protest. He looked from the lasagna to me, his brow furrowed as if he was trying to solve a complex math problem. The frantic energy in his eyes seemed to recede slightly, replaced by a deep, profound weariness. He nodded, a slow, sad dip of his chin. Yeah, he whispered, I'm really hungry. Another stretch of silence. The standoff had shifted. It was no longer about territory, it was about lasagna. I glanced at the massive dish. There was enough to feed me for a week. I looked back at the man in the doorway. He looked hollowed out, defeated. My mom's voice echoed in my head again. For emergencies. What defined an emergency? Keeping my eyes on him, I slowly lowered the spatula. I reached for the plate I'd set out for myself. With movements that were deliberately slow and non-threatening, I cut a generous square of the steaming lasagna, the cheese stretching in long, gooey strands. I slid it onto the plate. I then grabbed a fork from the drying rack. I took 2 steps forward and placed the plate on the small, rickety table we had by the door, right next to the key bowl. It was as far as I was willing to let him in. Here, I said, my voice steadier now. You can have this. But then you have to go, okay? You're in the wrong place. He stared at the plate, then at me, a flicker of confusion and something like gratitude in his glassy eyes. He shuffled forward, his movements still unsteady, and collapsed into the wooden chair by the table. He didn't even use the fork at first. He picked up the slice of lasagna with his hands and took a huge bite. I watched, mesmerized and horrified, as he devoured it. He ate like a man who hadn't seen food in days, with a desperate, single-minded intensity. He burned his mouth, I could tell, wincing and blowing out short breaths, but he didn't stop. In less than a minute, the slice was gone. He picked up the fork then and scraped the plate clean of every last bit of sauce. He set the fork down with a quiet clatter and looked up at me. The wildness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a dazed, post-meal calm. The scent of garlic and oregano now overpowered the sour smell he'd brought in with him. "Thank you," he said, his voice a little clearer. He looked around the apartment again, but this time his gaze was different, more present. He saw the photos of me and my family on the wall, my college textbooks, Chloe's garish neon pink throw pillow on the couch. A look of dawning realization, and then profound embarrassment, washed over his face. This isn't my apartment," he said, stating the obvious as if he were just discovering it. "No," I said softly. "It's not." He looked down at his hands, then back at the keys he'd dropped on the floor when he sat down. "I'm on the 11th floor," he mumbled. 11B. The keys, they look the same. He shook his head, a gesture of self-disgust. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I had a really bad day. I wasn't thinking straight." The rest of the story tumbled out of him in a low, ashamed monotone. His name was Mark. He lived directly above me. He'd lost his job a month ago. Today had been the final day of his severance. His girlfriend had left him a week prior. He'd spent the afternoon at a bar, trying to drink the feeling away, and had stumbled home, fumbled with his keys, and walked into the wrong apartment, convinced in his inebriated and despairing state that his life had somehow been erased, that even his own home wasn't his anymore. The smell of the lasagna, he said, was what had drawn him in. It smelled like a home, something he felt he'd lost. I listened, my earlier fear completely gone, replaced by a heavy, aching sympathy. Here was a man, a neighbor I'd probably passed in the elevator a dozen times without a second glance, who was drowning. His breaking point just happened to involve my front door and my mother's lasagna. "It's okay," I found myself saying. It's going to be okay." He gave a bitter, hollow laugh. "Yeah." He pushed himself up from the chair, swaying slightly. I should go." He bent down, picked up his keys, and shuffled back towards the open door. He paused on the threshold and turned back to me. The shame on his face was painful to see. "Thank you," he said again. "For the food, and for not calling the cops." I just nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He stepped out into the hallway and pulled the door shut behind him. This time, the sound of the lock engaging was a soft, final click. I stood in my kitchen for a long time, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator and the frantic beating of my own heart slowly returning to normal. The apartment was filled with the warm, comforting smell of lasagna, but the atmosphere had changed. It felt charged, different. I looked at the empty plate on the table, the fork lying askew. I looked at the half-eaten lasagna on the stovetop. My appetite was gone. I walked over and closed the front door, making sure the deadbolt and the chain lock were securely fastened. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood, trying to process what had just happened. A stranger had walked into my home. A lost, broken man named Mark had shared a meal with me, in the most bizarre and unplanned way imaginable. I thought about calling the police, or the building manager, to report what had happened. But the image of his face, the raw shame and gratitude, stopped me. He wasn't a threat. He was a human being who had hit a wall, and his crisis had intersected with my quiet Friday night. I ended up putting the rest of the lasagna away. I cleaned the plate he'd used, the hot water and soap feeling like a ritual, washing away the strangeness of the encounter. I put the vacuum cleaner away and went back to my essay, but the words still wouldn't come. My mind was elsewhere, on the 11th floor. The next day, I told Chloe everything. Her eyes widened in shock and then welled with tears as I got to the part about Mark eating the lasagna. "Oh, that's so sad," she'd whispered. We agreed to be more vigilant about locking the door, but we also felt a strange, newfound connection to the building, to the unseen lives happening just a ceiling away. A week later, I was taking out the trash when I saw him. Mark. He was coming out of 11B, dressed in neat slacks and a button-down shirt, clean-shaven. He looked tired, but sober and composed. Our eyes met in the hallway. He froze for a second, a flush creeping up his neck. I gave him a small, hesitant nod. He took a deep breath and walked over to me. "Jake, right?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Yeah," I said. I don't really know what to say, he began, looking at his shoes. About last week. I am so incredibly sorry. That was unforgivable. It's okay, I said, and this time I meant it. Really? How are you doing? He looked up, surprised by the question. I'm okay. Taking it one day at a time. I have a job interview this afternoon, actually. He gestured to his clothes. That's great, I said, and I genuinely felt it was. Good luck. Thank you, he said. He hesitated, then stuck out his hand. For everything. I shook it. It was a firm, solid handshake. We never became friends. We didn't start having coffee or hanging out. But after that, we were more than just neighbors who ignored each other. We'd nod in the elevator, exchange a few words about the weather. There was a shared, unspoken understanding between us, a secret tied to a Friday night, an open door, and a dish of lasagna. What happened when the door suddenly opened? My world got a little bigger, and a lot more complicated. I learned that fear and compassion can exist in the same moment, that a simple act of kindness, even one born from sheer panic and confusion, can be a lifeline. I learned that everyone has a story, a struggle you know nothing about, and that sometimes, the most dramatic moments aren't about violence or crime, but about the quiet, desperate breaking points of ordinary people. And I learned that my mother was right, as mothers often are. You should always be prepared for an emergency. You just never know what form it will take.